The Grave Hunter. The city at night was a graveyard of silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of a man running for his life. His white shirt was soaked in blood, a dark crimson spreading from the gunshot wound on his shoulder. His steps were heavy, not just with pain, but with the terror clawing at his back. Detective Adrian Locke had seen fear before. He had smelled it in interrogation rooms, tasted it in the air at crime scenes. But this was different. This was the kind of fear that twisted a man's soul before his body even hit the ground. And tonight, Adrian wasn't the hunter. He was the prey. It had all started with a simple missing person case. A young woman, Claire Evans, had vanished 2 weeks ago, leaving behind only a torn jacket and a smear of blood in a downtown alley. No ransom, no witnesses, no clues, until this morning, when a cryptic message arrived at Adrian's desk. "Stop digging, or I'll find a grave just for you." He didn't stop. He should have. Now, sprinting through the abandoned streets, he realized he had uncovered something far worse than a kidnapping. Claire wasn't the first to disappear, and if he didn't escape tonight, she wouldn't be the last. Adrian Locke crashed through the alley, his breath ragged, the pounding in his ears drowning out the world. The shadows seemed alive, stretching toward him as if they, too, were hunting. His shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed him, but he couldn't stop, not now, not when he was so close to the truth. A black sedan screeched around the corner behind him, headlights flaring like the eyes of a predator. The roar of an engine, the sharp bark of a gunshot. A bullet shattered the brick wall inches from his head, sending dust and debris raining down. Adrian dove behind a dumpster, heart hammering against his ribs. He fumbled for his phone, but it was gone, probably lost in the struggle back at the warehouse. He could still hear the voice of the man who had cornered him there. Low and cold as a grave. "You should have left this one alone, detective." He had barely escaped with his life, and now they were finishing the job. A second shot rang out, pinging off the metal behind him. He had to move, fast. His eyes darted to the fire escape above, his only chance. Summoning every ounce of strength, he leaped, fingers catching the rusted ladder. It groaned under his weight as he hauled himself up just as the car skidded to a stop below. A figure stepped out, tall, dressed in black, face obscured by shadows. Then, a voice, female, calm, familiar. "Adrian, you should have listened." His breath hitched. He knew that voice. Claire Evans, the woman who had supposedly disappeared. Adrian froze on the fire escape, his pulse slamming in his throat. The woman standing below, bathed in the glow of the car's headlights. Shouldn't be here. Claire Evans had vanished 2 weeks ago. Every lead pointed to her being dead. But there she was, alive, and aiming a gun at him. "You look surprised, detective." Her voice was smooth, almost amused. Adrian gritted his teeth. "You sent the note." Claire smirked. "And yet, you kept digging." A wave of cold realization crashed over him. This wasn't a simple kidnapping. He had been played from the start. A second figure stepped out of the car. This one Adrian didn't recognize. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes like empty pits. The man whispered something to Claire, and she nodded before turning her gaze back upward. "Get down here, Adrian. Let's talk." He didn't move. His instincts screamed at him to run. But something darker, more dangerous, kept him locked in place. He had to know. "Talk about what?" he called down. Claire tilted her head, the gun in her hand lowering slightly. "About the real reason you were put on this case. About why you were always meant to find me." Adrian's breath hitched. Meant to find her? Then, before he could react, Claire raised the gun again, this time not at him, but at the bolts holding the fire escape ladder. A deafening gunshot. The rusted metal gave way, and Adrian Locke fell. Adrian Locke hit the ground hard. Pain exploded through his ribs as the impact knocked the breath from his lungs. Darkness threatened to swallow his vision, but adrenaline forced him back to reality. Above him, Claire stood motionless, her gun still smoking. The broad-shouldered man took a step forward, but Claire held up a hand, stopping him. "He's not going anywhere." Adrian groaned, rolling onto his side. His body screamed in protest, but he forced himself onto his hands and knees. His mind was racing. Every instinct told him to run, but run where? They had him trapped. Claire crouched beside him, lowering her voice to a whisper. "You were never supposed to survive this long, detective." Adrian clenched his jaw. "Then why am I still breathing?" A smile ghosted across Claire's lips. "Because I want you to know the truth before you die." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Without another word, she slipped it into his jacket and stood up. "Get him in the car." The last thing Adrian saw before a boot slammed into his head was Claire's cold, knowing smile. Then, blackness. A dull, throbbing pain dragged Adrian back to consciousness. His head felt like it had been split open. His ribs ached with every breath. And his hands were bound tight. The car rumbled beneath him, the low hum of the engine filling the silence. Through his blurred vision, he could make out the faint glow of streetlights flickering past the tinted windows. He was in the back seat, wrists tied behind him, his gun gone. Across from him, Claire Evans watched in silence. Her legs were crossed, her fingers tapping idly against her knee. The man in the driver's seat remained a dark, looming figure, saying nothing. Adrian swallowed hard, forcing his mind to focus. He could still feel the folded piece of paper Claire had slipped into his jacket. Why give him something if she planned to kill him? Where are we going? His voice was rough, laced with exhaustion. Claire tilted her head. You'll see soon enough. Adrian exhaled slowly, forcing his pulse to steady. He needed to stall, to think. You're not the victim, are you? He said, watching her carefully. You were never missing. Claire smiled, slow, deliberate. Took you long enough. Adrian's jaw tightened. So what is this? A setup? A game? Her expression darkened. It's justice, detective, the kind you and your badge could never give. The car made a sharp turn, and for the first time, Adrian saw where they were heading, a narrow road leading toward an abandoned warehouse district near the docks. No cameras, no witnesses, a perfect place to disappear. Adrian flexed his fingers, feeling the tight knot of his restraints. He had minutes, maybe seconds, to act. Because if they got him inside that warehouse, he wasn't coming out. The car rolled to a stop. Outside, the docks stretched into the fog, the skeletal remains of abandoned warehouses looming in the darkness. Waves lapped against the shore, their rhythm broken only by the metallic clank of the car doors unlocking. Adrian's pulse quickened. This was it. The broad-shouldered man stepped out first, scanning the area before yanking the back door open. Out. Adrian hesitated. He could still feel the folded paper in his jacket, his only clue in this deadly game. But he had no time to read it now. Claire leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't do anything stupid, detective. Adrian gritted his teeth and stepped out. The night air was thick with salt and rust, the scent of decay clinging to the abandoned buildings. The man grabbed his arm, shoving him forward. A single warehouse stood ahead, its towering doors slightly ajar. A dim light flickered from inside. Someone was waiting. Adrian's mind raced. He needed a plan. His hands were still bound, his gun gone. But something about Claire's behavior nagged at him. She was playing a role, but for whom? As they stepped through the doors, the scene inside sent a chill down Adrian's spine. A chair sat in the center of the empty space. A spotlight overhead cast long shadows against the concrete floor. And behind that chair, a row of freshly dug graves. Claire stepped past him, turning to face him fully for the first time. You were never supposed to find me, Adrian. Her voice was quiet, controlled. But now that you have, you need to understand why. She nodded toward the graves. Because you're not the only one who was hunting. A figure emerged from the darkness, someone Adrian never expected to see. His blood ran cold. Adrian's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped into the light. Detective Marcus Hale, his former partner, a man who had been declared dead 2 years ago. Adrian's mind reeled. This wasn't possible. He had been at Marcus's funeral. He had seen the body, closed the damn case himself. And yet, here he was. Alive, breathing, smiling. Hello, old friend, Marcus said, his voice carrying the same easy confidence Adrian remembered. He looked unchanged, except for the cold, calculating glint in his eyes. Adrian clenched his fists. No, this isn't real. Claire crossed her arms. Oh, it's real, detective. You just never saw the whole picture. Adrian's chest tightened. Pieces of the puzzle started snapping together. The missing persons case, Claire's cryptic message, the graves. You faked your death, Adrian muttered, eyes locked on Marcus. Why? Marcus sighed, as if the answer was obvious. Because the people we were chasing, Adrian, the monsters we thought we were stopping, they weren't the real problem. The system was. His smile faded. I stopped playing by their rules. And now, I make my own. Adrian felt a chill creep up his spine. Claire was never missing, he realized. She was working for you. Claire didn't deny it. She just held his gaze. Not just me. Adrian turned back to Marcus. And the graves? Marcus's smirk returned. Insurance. Adrian's stomach twisted. He had walked straight into a trap. Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You always did have a knack for digging too deep, Adrian. And now, he gestured toward the open grave behind him. You finally hit the bottom. The man behind Adrian grabbed his shoulder, shoving him toward the chair. Claire took a slow step forward, her face unreadable. Adrian's mind screamed for a way out. This was it, his last chance. He tensed his muscles, ready to make his move. And then, somewhere outside, the unmistakable sound of sirens shattered the silence. Marcus's eyes darkened. Claire exhaled sharply. The trap had been set. But Adrian wasn't the only one walking into it. The wail of sirens cut through the night, bouncing off the steel walls of the warehouse, Flashing red and blue lights reflected in Marcus's dark eyes. For the first time, his confidence wavered. Adrian allowed himself the faintest smirk. They weren't expecting backup. You think you've won? Marcus's voice was low, dangerous. You really think this changes anything? Adrian didn't answer. His hands were still bound. But his mind was already 10 steps ahead. The sirens grew louder. Tires screeched outside. Officers shouting. Then, gunfire. Claire and Marcus exchanged a quick glance. The man holding Adrian hesitated, his grip loosening just enough. Now, Adrian slammed his shoulder into the man's gut, using the impact to spin and hook his leg around the thug's knee. The guy went down hard, his gun skidding across the floor. Adrian dove for it, twisting just as Marcus drew his own weapon. Bang! A gunshot rang out, but it wasn't Marcus who fired. Claire stood there, her gun raised, aimed at Marcus. A stunned silence filled the air. Marcus staggered back, a dark stain spreading across his chest. His breath hitched, his eyes locking onto Claire in disbelief. You? He choked out. You were supposed to. Claire exhaled sharply. I never worked for you. Marcus, I worked against you. Marcus's legs buckled. He dropped to his knees, eyes dark with fury. You have no idea what you've just done. Claire's expression didn't change. No, Marcus. She took a step closer, lowering the gun. I knew exactly what I was doing. Outside, officers flooded the warehouse, weapons raised. Drop your guns. Marcus let out a weak, bitter laugh. You think this ends with me? His breath shuddered. There are more of us. Bigger than you can imagine. And they're still out there. His body slumped forward, dead. Adrian sat there, catching his breath as officers rushed in. One of them moved to cut his restraints. Another hauled the last remaining thug to his feet. Claire turned to leave. Adrian caught her wrist. Wait. She looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time. You played me, he said. It wasn't a question. Claire's expression softened. I led you here. Adrian searched her eyes. And now what? A small, knowing smile touched her lips. Now? She pulled free from his grip, stepping backward into the shadows. Now, you keep digging. And just like that, she was gone. Adrian exhaled, watching as officers secured the scene, their radios crackling with updates. His gaze drifted to the row of graves behind him. Marcus was right about one thing. This wasn't over. Not even close. The end.